Well, anyhow, what I wanted to start off with is about invisible obstacles, the new title. And I wanted to point out that obviously, invisible obstacles means that they are real obstacles, but they are invisible.
Oh, I have to relate something to you because I was talking to somebody who studied theology yesterday, in the past. I asked him what he liked, and he said he really liked when he had an exam about dogmatism, and he burst out in laughing because somebody had figured out the seven unknowable qualities of God. The seven unknowable qualities of God. I mean, and he said it was so funny, because it's like the unknowable qualities of God.
Right. Understood.
Quite.
Because if they were unknowable, then obviously this great genius
And he had figured it out.
Right. Okay. Anyhow.
Kan iedereen zichzelf even muten?
Oh ja, ik ga me muten.
I caught that keyword mute. I love that red chair, by the way. It has like something out of Marvel comic books to it, which is really cool. Okay. And then there was silence. The sound of silence. By the way, do you guys know that Simon and Garfunkel were two yeshiva guys that went to Queens Yeshiva in New York, and they started their singing career at bar mitzvahs? Just thought you might find it. Just came to my mind because of sounds of silence. Anyhow, very interesting people. So therefore, the idea of invisible obstacles is obviously where there's a case of a real obstacle, but it's invisible. And believe it or not, this is actually one of the 613 commandments in the Torah, which is the prohibition against placing a stumbling block in front of the blind. Right? So therefore, a blind person can't see, and a person who goes over and puts a obstacle, right, or something of which can be of damage to this person, so then that becomes something which is prohibited in the Torah. Now, the Gemara, which is very interesting, we're going to get into the Gemara in a minute, immediately says, well, something, I'll say it differently. One of the great rabbis of Jerusalem of maybe 2 centuries ago, Rabbi Salant, used to say that the first of the 10 commandments is don't be a fool, that common sense is the most important thing you can have as somebody who is Jewish. You have to have common sense, and everything else builds upon that. So therefore, many times the question becomes, do you have, it's common sense to tell me, common sense would tell me itself not to put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. So why does God have to tell me that, right? In actually even American law, which is based on certain aspects of even in Latin expressions, they have malum per se and malum prohibitum. Malum per se means that something you would understand intuitively to be prohibited. Like you shouldn't need a law to say don't steal. That's something you should know on your own. That's malum per se. But malum prohibitum is where it's only because you and I decide to make it prohibited. In other words, there is nothing naturally prohibited about a red light. But we as a society get together and we agree that a red light will mean stop. So therefore, there's a difference between those things which we understand automatically, let's say, as thinking human beings. And there are other things which we would not have thought of, like why red? Maybe purple lights should be stopped. But we come to conclude, and therefore we make them prohibited. So therefore, putting a stumbling block in front of a person would be something like malum per se. It's like something you don't need to be told. And the Talmud is very sensitive to that. And therefore, it does not, although of course, one who were physically to see a blind person and run over and remove a manhole in the street so they go fall, that of course would be a violation of this law. But the Talmud isn't satisfied that that is really the primary issue that's at hand here. And it goes into many examples. I mean, modern day examples would be if, God forbid, you know somebody who is a heroin addict and you give them money to buy heroin. That would fall under this prohibition in the Torah of not giving a stumbling block, because you know that this person is too weak to resist buying the heroin. And if you're enabling him to do so, then you are putting a stumbling block in a spiritual way for this person to be able to harm themselves. But the interesting thing is that the very source of the commandment of putting a stumbling block in front of a person is actually the Gemara in Nedorim, which I printed out here. I'll just read it quickly in English. And there, the Gemara says like this. I'll explain it. I'll read it and then I'll explain it. The Gemara points out that there is nothing more repulsive to God than idolatry. Idolatry steals from people their chance in their limited time on this planet to find eternal life through a real and honest connection to the one God. Giving strength to idolatry is called putting a stumbling block before the blind, since by doing so, the chances are great that you have caused a spiritually blind person to trip. So this is why we as Jews believe that in the giving of the Ten Commandments, the first two of the Ten Commandments were said simultaneously. The first of the Ten Commandments is Anochi, I am God. And the second one is Lo Iyeh, do not have another God. And the Zohar explains that the reason that these were said simultaneously was to teach us you cannot have one without the other. If a person really, really has an authentic understanding of what it means to have a relationship with one God, which is not necessarily an easy thing to do, and I'm not saying that any of us, including myself, have that authentic awareness, but at least being mentally aware of that authentic awareness would negate by nature that there was any other God. In other words, it's imagine if you could have a room where the room like split in half and one side of the room was light and the other side of the room was dark. It wouldn't be the same room. You could do it if you had a wall in between them, but to have a light lit and dark in the same room, it can't, because they can't coincide. And the reason they don't coincide is because light and darkness are the opposites of each other, in the sense that darkness is an absence of light. It's not like you have pears and apples. So the pears and apples, you can put pears and apples next to each other, even though they're completely different fruit. But the reality of darkness is an absence of light. So therefore, if you have light, you cannot have darkness, not in the exact same place, because the light will negate the darkness. Which is why, I mean, if you go deeper into this, you can realize that you don't have a little machine. I think I've mentioned this before. You don't have a little machine that blows darkness into a room. The way you create darkness is by removing light. So therefore, if a person were to really assume that the oneness of God is all-encompassing, unlike pantheism that expresses the idea that God is inside of nature, Judaism says that nature is inside of God. Everything is inside of God, if, of course, you believe in this idea. And therefore, if everything is inside of God, then there's nothing outside the spectrum of God. And therefore, that which would be deemed the outside the spectrum of God is idolatry. Now, idolatry, which we'll get to a little bit later, from a Jewish perspective, is the ultimate, now this case, is the ultimate obstacle illusion, as opposed to the invisible obstacles. But we'll get to that in a few more minutes later. But the point here is that the source of this concept of not putting a stumbling block in front of a blind person is attributed to idolatry. Now, why is that interesting? I think it's interesting on two levels. One level, it's interesting because the actual commandment of not putting a stumbling block in front of a blind person sounds like a very real thing. You know, you got something in your hand, You throw it in front of a guy who's running and he trips over it. And yet the Gemara's definition of this commandment is a purely spiritual thing. And here is talking about somebody who's in fact not physically blind, but spiritually blind, which raises an interesting question about being spiritually blind. In other words, in your own mind, how would you equate the difference between a person who, God forbid, is really physically blind to a person who refuses to open their eyes? Absolutely refuses to open their eyes, no matter what you do. So technically, in a certain sense, they're the same, because neither can see. But I think your threshold of tolerance for the person who's physically blind would be very, very high, with a lot of compassion and a desire to assist. But if the other person, who we would call in the streets of New York a moron, is somebody who is refusing to open their eyes, well, we might do the old New York healing process, where we smack them in the face and suddenly their eyes will pop open, which I wouldn't really recommend. But the point being is that such a person you might have very little patience for. What do you mean, can I help hold your hand and walk you down the street? Open your eyes. You can't say that to the blind person, but you would be tempted to say it to a spiritually blind person. And the Torah comes to tell us, ironically, we have to have the same compassion for a person who keeps their eyes closed, is as if they were really physically blind. Because a person who will not open their eyes under any circumstance, no matter how much you put reality in front of them, unless, of course, you are Don Quixote and they come and they surround you with mirrors. But even then, you have to open your eyes to see the mirrors. But no matter how much you resist, wanting to see the world is not necessarily the way we would like the world to be. And therefore, we live within our world at the defiance of all other evidence that may suggest, well, that might not really be what the world is all about. So for such a person, the Torah says we also have to have compassion. And we have to be sure that we don't reinforce the fantasy that they live in, because what happens is, really, at the end of the day, which we all know, we've spoken about this a lot in this group, so it won't be a shock to anybody, but nobody gets out of here alive. What? Yeah, it's true. Nobody gets out of alive. I mean, the death thing is only a when. It's not an if. And the more that we can be sober and not frightened by that, the more our now living becomes so precious. If God forbid, all of a sudden somebody said to, I don't want to say you, somebody said to somebody, you've got 3 days left to live. Oh, you know what? I have a better. Did you guys ever see the Woody Allen movie? I think it was Hannah and the Three Sisters. And they think that they found a brain tumor in Woody Allen's head. And he's freaked out, obviously. And now is the scene, he's coming into the New York hospital and he's sitting in the chair and the doctor comes in. It was obviously an old movie because he had the x-rays you have to put up on the whiteboards, which they don't do anymore. Anyhow, the doctor comes and says, listen, I'm sorry, Mr. Allen, we don't have time here to waste. I'll cut right to the chase. You have a massive brain tumor. I think you'll probably live maybe 3 or 4 days. And you could see Woody Allen's whole life collapse. I'm not ready to die. This is not me. This can't be happening to me. And he goes through, as only Woody Allen could do, an incredible existential crisis. And while he's on the edge of despair, suddenly the doctor really walks in and says, Mr. Allen, I've got great news. Somehow, some way, that tumor's completely gone. You're completely fine. You're a healthy man. Shakes his hand. So the first one was simply in Woody Allen's obstacle illusion of imagining with his fears the horror of what he thought was going to happen. And then the reality of it was that it didn't happen at all. In fact, in the movie, he has a new lease on life. He goes skipping like a little kid through Central Park singing. So if somebody told us that there was just X amount of time for us, if we were really sober, We would hug and kiss everybody we love. We would take each a gift. The things that would get us all upset and angry and we fight over them would dissolve and go away. We would look at the flowers with different eyes. Everything would be different. We would have such a deep appreciation for every moment of our life. And guess what? That is reality. So what? It's not 3 days, God forbid. Even if it's 70 years from now, it's going to happen. So allow that reality. It might not be the one we like. If you and I were writing the script, maybe we wouldn't include death. But the one who wrote the script did. And here we are on the stage. So therefore, we can use that horrifying reality as an amazing blessing to enrich every moment of our lives. It tones us down. It takes us off our throne. It takes the all-important issues that we get angry about and shows them how trivial they are. And the things which are really important and precious, like loving the people who love us no matter what and being accepting of them, we can do that because we can hurl that in realizing the sacredness of our lives. So therefore, when a person is got by choice to close their eyes, what they have done is they have lost sight of our reality. They have created a fantasy. And we all do it. We've created our own Peter Pan. We live with this illusion of eternity. It's not true. We live with the illusion of X, Y, Z. Possibly also not true. We donate how many years of our lives pursuing our millions of dollars that maybe we make, maybe we don't. You know, in America, they used to say, when a guy closed a big deal, he said we were laughing all the way to the bank. Sounds like a modern version of like Santa Claus. But anyhow, laughing all the way to the bank. So my father, blessed memory, who was a New York attorney, he used to say, that's terrible. No. What you have to do is you have to wait 6 months. The money's in the bank 6 months and nobody's suing you to get it back. Then in 6 months, you can be happy. But really, it's hard to imagine. I mean, I grew up in a community surrounded by extremely wealthy individuals in a little town in New York called Great Neck. And I knew the inside stories there. I saw the families on the inside. I mean, we're talking major money. There wasn't happiness there. There were affairs going on between the wives and the husbands with different people, or the lifeguard, or the guy who mowed the lawn, or whatever. There was all kinds of people all of a sudden yanked out of their house by the FBI for huge money scandal, money laundering, and who knows what. There were people who overdosed on cocaine or shot each other. And I mean, it was just crazy. But on the outside, everyone put on the face. Everyone had the nice Rolls Royce or the Bentley or the Jaguar in the parking lot. You know, everyone had the beautiful home, and everyone's lawn was, you could lie down and eat on it at any moment. Even their dogs pooped gold, right? Everything was exactly the way it had to look. But that's just how deep it was. It was a fantasy. This fantasy is really what Judaism refers to as idolatry. It's not, idolatry is not stupid looking Aztec statues that suddenly talk, you know, and you bow to them and you offer them your firstborn or your pancreas or whatever. That's not what it's all about. That's not what idolatry is. Because what it really boils down to is the difference between belief in God or the belief in an idol is simple, one line. Idolatry is creating God in your image. Judaism is being created in the image of God. Creating God in your image, or our image, I don't mean you, God forbid, but in one's image is some point or another, assuming that the person is half intelligent, I'm not sure which half, but let's say half intelligent, such a person is going to realize, okay, yeah, I am cool, and I know this, and I know that, and I know this, but at the end of the day, I'm just me. And I certainly didn't put the sun in the sky. I certainly am not controlling with an app every single person's heartbeat at the same time all around the world, right? Like Bruce Almighty, if you ever saw that amazingly cool, clever movie, it's with Jim Carrey and Freeman, Morgan Freeman, where suddenly Bruce Carey becomes God for a few days. And the first day that he's God, he turns on his computer and says, you have 1 trillion emails. So, I'm not managing this world. I'm not the one who designed and handcrafted every single little eye in a fly's eye. So there must be something I'm willing to say a little bit beyond me. So therefore, I'll create this idol. That idol creates the rain. This idol creates the stock market. This idol creates whatever I need it to do. And I will tell it what powers it has and what it doesn't. And I will even write how it should be worshipped, because I created God in my image to want to be God. This stems from the Garden of Eden. The whole downfall began with an ego desire to want to be like God. The snake said to Eve, he said, listen, baby, the reason God said to you, don't eat from that fruit is because God knows. That's probably the first time it was ever said, God knows. God knows that if you eat from that fruit, you're going to become like God. And God doesn't want you to become like God. And Eve said, woo, I like that. I like that. I'd like to be God. Sure, I'd like to be God. I'll be God. I'll tell God which of his commandments I will observe and which ones I won't. I will decide what the purpose of life is. I don't need God to do it. I'm a poet. And so therefore, this was the whole beginning and really the crux of idolatry when we want to be God. And we can be, because the insanity of God's infinite love is that he will tolerate us in no matter what we do. Because he loves us so much, he's given us free will. And he loves us so much, he's created a dark planet, like a playing field with just so much time on the court. And as long as the clock ticks, every time you score, you get a point. But once the clock stops ticking, it's game over. And while we're in this world trying to figure this out, God will let us go any way we want. We have to be able to be smarter than that and become humble enough to realize that we are creating the image of God. And that shifts 180 degrees everything. If I am about created in the image of God, then my whole focus becomes, how am I using my life in the expression of being created in the image of God? As opposed to what my gods are, which are created in my own image. And so therefore, this idea of idolatry, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, I don't know if you are familiar with the writings or the talkings of a great rabbi that the world lost not long ago called Jonathan Sacks from London. Jonathan Sacks is phenomenal. But I got to tell you, if you're not familiar with Rabbi Hirsch is Jonathan Sacks on steroids. And not only that, I mean, unless you read, Deutsch, German, that is, he wrote in German. So I don't understand German. Instead, I don't know why I have to do this, but it's just because I am. I'm going to just stop here 1 minute. Time to insert a joke. So it's during the Iraq. I'm allowed to put in my own commercials. So it was during the Iraq War, and the French were not going to join the Americans in the Gulf War. There was a huge thing going on. Americans were taking French wine and pouring it into the river, similar like we took the British tea in Boston and threw it into the water, and names of French toast became, American toast. The Americans basically hated the French more because they wouldn't participate in the Gulf War. So there was a story said to be true, but it's probably just urban rumor. The American ambassador to the United Nations walks into the elevator, and there is the French ambassador with a few other people. And the American ambassador says to the French ambassador, "Sprechen Sie Deutsch?" And the French ambassador says, "No." And the American ambassador says, "Well, you should thank us." Anyhow, it's a little American side humor. So Rabbi Hirsch wrote amazing, and it's in German. And in English, it's still amazing. And the way that he addresses what we're talking about is as follows. He says, there is no greater freedom than the freedom of the cult of self. Right? I hope that the word cult is a familiar word to you all, because I really wouldn't know how to translate it otherwise. But a cult of self, that we can tend to engulf ourselves in a cult-like worship, almost narcissistic, of ourself. And that,
Can you repeat that for a moment?
sure. He says there is no greater freedom than the freedom from cult, C-U-L-T, of self. That a person can engulf themselves inside a almost narcissistic, self-worshiping idol, I-D-L-E, idol worship, a whole different idea of idol worship, I-D-L-E, where you go into idol. You're not moving anywhere because you're trapped in this narcissistic sense of the whole world revolves around me. And freedom from that is the biggest blessing of a person's life, is to be able to reach that level of freedom, where you are actually, instead of a narcissistic, ego-based love, you have authentic love of who you really are. Because the love of who you really are is more than 1,000,000 times better than whatever we can conceive. We conceive these things because we're in pain. We conceive these things because we're confused. We might conceive these things because we don't know what's happening around us. So we have to have a game plan of some sort to try to make sense. And when those things crumble, we're in horror. But you know what? Instead of building castles in the sand, we can actually just sort of look and see, open our eyes and see what the world really is all about, what is going on. And when we do that, this is called in Kabbalah taking hold of the tree of life. Please.
There's maybe a person waiting to be admitted.
I didn't see any blue on the thing here.
Oh, okay, good.
Sorry.
Also.
Okay. I see another one admitted. Okay. So the tree of life, or I'll say this differently. I'll share with you a very beautiful teaching of the Arizal. The Arizal says, and if you read carefully in the Bible, in the Torah, in the original Hebrew, in Bereshit, you will see that it talks about a tree in the middle of the garden. And it turns out that the tree of knowledge of good and bad and the tree of life are both in the middle of the garden. Now, this was long before Einstein was born, so Noah was talking about the impossibility of two things to occupy at the same place at the same time. So the way the Arizal explains it is that the tree is one tree, and then it has two trunks. And one trunk is the tree of life, and the other trunk is the tree of knowledge of good and bad. But there's something very interesting here. Well, I'm sorry, I should finish the thought first. And therefore, the free will is really about wanting the tree of knowledge of good and bad, as Eve had opted for in order to be like God. And the other is to really want to understand what life is that we have, and that's the tree of life. Now, if these two are our polar points upon which our free will of choice is working, you would almost think it'd be two separate trees, right? There's this tree or there's that tree. There's good or there's bad. Make up your mind, make your choice, right? We used to say in America, you sleep in the bed that you made. So pick what you want to sleep in. But the Arizal says something very deep. Everything comes from the same source. That's why these two trees share the same base. The only difference is the application, the unfolding, not this core reality. The core reality is everything is from God and everything is good. But the real reality that we live in is good and bad. So in that reality, of course, there are things which are horrific. And on some higher level, they are good, but we can't even relate to those higher levels. But there is a way to take the higher level and make it here in this world where even at the moment of looking at bad, we can still see good. This was Rebbe Akiva's Rebbe, who was known as Nachum Ish Gamzu, because he had such a miserable, difficult, painful life. It's beyond comprehension. And yet he was known as a man who was in perpetual joy. He was never sad. And anything happened to him, such as at one point he had his legs and arms amputated, he would always respond, Gamzeh l'tova. This too is for the best. Now, obviously, I hope you would be obvious to all of us. If this gentleman was Rebbe Akiva's teacher, I'm going to put my chips and bet that he's not a moron. He's not somebody who's just whacked out of their mind. Actually, I don't know if I'm sure I've said this a few times in our class, but he's my favorite of all-time cartoonists, Gary Larson, who used to write Far Side. So one of my favorite Gary Larson cartoons, he has themes, and one of his themes was hell, where they had these 11-foot tall devils managing hell. And so one of them were these two devils, and all the people in hell are walking below them in a path, jammed. They all have wheelbarrows with giant rocks on them, and they're sweating and they're miserable. And among them is one guy whistling like this, whistling with his little wheelbarrow. And one of the devils says to the other one, I don't think we're getting through to that guy, right? So there is this idea by Nachman Ish Gamzu. He was genius beyond genius. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been Rebbe Akiva's teacher. Trust me on that one. But he was able to hold on to the tree of life to such a degree that the stimulus of happiness was not dependent on external items or elements. I will be happy when. I will be happy when I win the lottery. I will be happy when I graduate. I will be happy when I find my lover. All these I will be happy fill in the blanks, because we all have them. And unfortunately, sometimes they never come. And then when they come, it's not exactly what we were hoping they would be. And so therefore, we put our happiness outside of ourselves. We put it in other circumstances beyond our control, even though we like to think we are totally in control. And so therefore, by this gentleman, he realized happiness is an internal thing. I remember there was a cute cartoon of a family. It was a father and a mother and a boy and a girl, and they were up on a mountain in an Indian ashram meditating. And they were sitting there in a locust position, like as if they were in a car. The husband was there and the wife was behind him, and to his side rather, and behind him was his son, and behind him was the girl. The four of them were sitting there on this mountain doing the lotus thing, and the kids are yelling, "Are we there yet?" Right? So there is this idea of, have we reached nirvana yet? Am I in ultimate bliss yet? I remember a rabbi once said to me, he said, imagine if you had a special pen with a button on the top. And the minute you thought you were at the peak of happiness you will ever be at, push the button. That was one of the Israeli songs in Eurovision. Push the button, right? Push the button. And what will happen is you'll die, but you will remain on that level of happiness forever. So at the moment that you think that you have reached the highest level of happiness, push that button. You know what? I don't think you'd push it, because we would all be suspect that, well, maybe 5 minutes from now I'll be even happier. And that's a real good suspicion, because as long as we're alive, we are growing. And so whatever we think is the ultimate happiness today, because I just got a wonderful Schwinn bicycle, I later found out isn't half as cool as getting my first Kawasaki motorcycle, and so on and so on. So we have that ability to constantly grow and to constantly become wiser or even happier, but not if it's dependent outside of ourselves. If we have it within ourselves, we are able, as crazy as it sounds, like Nachum Ish Gamzu, to look at horror and be able to still be in a state of joy. Because somehow, somewhere, not in my mind, I don't think in your minds, but at least let's take a little spaceship trip into the minds of those who were thinking like that. They were able to see God at every moment because they held on to this tree of life. So now I want to, please, you're the rabbi here.
I just have a question, because you say that people like Gamzu are able to keep their happiness when they see horror. I'm not sure that I.
Well,
But
they
to
see
do
it as
that,
horror.
huh?
Such a gentleman will not see it as horror.
But I mean, that almost sounds as if horror is a matter of perception.
In part, yes, for sure.
Yeah, in part. But if you see, let's say, somebody being mutilated by somebody wielding a sword.
Of course. So listen, I want to tell you, as you know, I once had an extremely handicapped child.
Yes,
And he was a resident of a special hospital in Jerusalem called Alin Hospital.
absolutely.
And one of the most, among the many experiences of that period of my life before he passed away, I would have people would come to visit. And I noticed something, because this was an intense hospital. This is intense. And two of my friends would come in, and they would walk through the halls, and they would see the various children and so on and so on and so on. And I would then later hear from one of them that it almost broke his belief in God to see such suffering. And I would hear from the other one that it actually made him realize how much he has to appreciate life and God. In other words, two people seeing the exact same reality, and both of them coming away with totally different opinions or thoughts. And in fact, this is where I was going to go ahead, please.
I understand that, and I have known your son, and I understand that, and I understand also what a blessing he was to you. But I mean, there is also horror. I mean, with the 7 October
Oh,
pogrom,
okay, but you know what?
it was horror. I mean, and I would think that that is a different category, probably.
Right. So, well, okay, a very good point. Allow me to qualify it. Rav Salant, to come back to him again, he said like this: when something horrible happens to us, our challenge is to be able to ask ourselves, which is an extremely difficult challenge, to ask ourselves, why is this happening to me? And try to understand if there's a lesson to be learned. When this is Reb Salant. Reb Salant says, but when you see another person suffer, then you have to believe that there's no God, and you become God, and you do everything you possibly can to help them. So there is a difference between seeing somebody else suffering, and the reaction should be to instantly pick up your gun and go out there and take care of that situation. But when something, and therefore the situations of Nachum Ish Gamzu were only events that happened to him that he said those expressions. So of course, remember that was the first thing I quoted of Salant.
Well, that's what I always say, that I can decide for myself that everything in my life, even all the horrible things, are okay, but you can never say it to another. And if you say you have to really do something about it and become God, I mean, for what you see, I mean, I'm satisfied with that.
Yeah, okay. I mean, but you're right. Thank you. I should have qualified that. That, of course, is that, and we know that from Jewish law. I mean, the Jewish law is, if the enemy tells you that they're going to wipe you off the map of the world, you do not have to wait for them to do it. You get up. The Gemara says you get up and you kill your enemy before he even gets up in the morning. There's no heroism in war. That's nonsense. There are no John Waynes except in movies. So that's of course we have to deal with that with full capacity, and to whatever degree we have to deal with that. But I want to come back now a little bit more to this idea of obstacle illusion. And I want to show you that the thing about obstacle illusion is a difference between objective reality and subjective perception. I mean, we live in a world today where perception supersedes objective reality. It's because I believe that therefore that becomes the reality, rather than the reality is, and therefore I understand what it is. There's a huge shift in this differences between object reality and personal perception. And this has huge ramifications in law. How do we weigh these things? Where's the priority? What's the difference between your right as an individual versus a community's right? Right? Because I, as an individual, can say, I want to do whatever I want to do. I buy a room in a boat and I want to build a fire in there. Who are you to tell me you can't build that fire? Well, there's that conflict. My right as an individual to build a fire in my cabin, and your right as the boat, the collective society, to say, hey, jerk, you're going to sink the boat, we're all going to die. How do you define these lines? These are, every single society has dealt with the issue of individual rights and where they end according to where society rights then begin, and so on. And of course, it's as well in Judaism. So therefore, this idea of objective reality and subjective perception, believe it or not, is a very Jewish concept as well. And I want to show you some examples that might never have come to your mind, where we will see that your attitude, when I say you, I don't mean you, a person's attitude will directly impact a legal decision. First place we'll go to are the laws of Shabbat. Shabbat is built upon 39 forms, or like I like to say, formulas of the way the tabernacle, the Mishkan, was built. Those 39 forms of work are also the 39 forms, the way the Mishkan, the tabernacle was built, are the same way that Shabbat is observed. Those same 39, according to the mystics, are the algorithms that God used in creating the world. So the Mishkan, the tabernacle, is a microcosm of all of creation, but it's in the physical. Shabbat is the temple, but it's in the spiritual, or in time. And therefore, the way that it works in space versus the way that it works in time, or the physical versus the spiritual, they are actually the same movements, but a 180-degree difference. In other words, in the physical world, I require proactive physical doing. I have to hammer the nail in the wood to build the whatever. In the Shabbat, I have to do the same hammering the nail in the wood by not doing it. By actively focusing and restraining on those 39 techniques and not doing them, I have to digress maybe to make this a little bit clearer. There is a commandment in the Torah which says, thou shalt not eat cheeseburgers. Okay, that doesn't mean 24/7 of your day you're racking up heaven for not eating cheeseburgers. It doesn't work like that. It's only when the cheeseburger has just come right out of the McDonald's oven and the cheese is dripping over the side and your drool is dripping faster than the cheese, and you really just want to dig into that cheeseburger and you say, you know what? This time I'm not going to do it. That's when you get the heaven for having not eaten the cheeseburger. But it's only when it's in your face and you say no that you actually have fulfilled the commandment. So it's only when you want to turn on a light on Shabbat, which is one of the 39 forms of building of the tabernacle, which was lighting fire. Because all of these things, there's nothing born out of nothing. So everything in this world is a continuation of all that ever was created. So the manifestation in today's world is a lighting of a light as opposed to a lighting of a fire. But you resist, you're actually doing a positive act through resisting. Because now the same energy that if you were building the physical temple, you would have had to physically do it. Now by stymieing that physical energy, it gets converted and risen into a higher spiritual creativity of building a temple in time, which is what Shabbat is all about. So that actually what's happening is on Shabbat, every Shabbat and Yom Tov as well, we are all busily building our eternal home. And as the Gemara says, you only eat on Shabbat what you cooked during the week. So too, you only have in the world to come what you prepared in this world. So this world becomes a world of preparation in the performance of Shabbat, which is the opposite way of building than you would build in a physical world. And that's the basic idea of the observance. Now, we're going to show you where we have obstacle illusion here. One is you start to trickle down into the minutia. You know, I always love when people say, I'm not really interested in the details, right? Can you imagine getting on a plane and as you're boarding, the mechanic is talking to the pilot and the pilot says, well, how does it look? I'm kind of in a rush. Yeah, it's okay. You wouldn't get on that plane. You wouldn't get on that plane. I think a few of the screws are a little loose on the wing, but hey, you'll be all right. You wouldn't get on that plane. So this is your life. You wouldn't get on that plane. This is also your life. Sometimes sometimes God is in the detail. So on one of those trickle downs, one of these particular prohibitions is an agricultural activity, which is against planting. The first step of planting is you take a plow and you make a groove in the ground. Okay? So how does that roll out? So now you want to push a baby wagon across a lawn. Well, if you're pushing the baby wagon across a lawn, the wheels are going to make a groove. Yet, it's permissible. Why? Because unique to Shabbat is a term called malacha makshava, that it's not merely malacha, which is a work, it's a work attached to thought. That the work by itself is not the criteria, but rather it's the thought that was attached to the work. So therefore, in this case, if the reason you're pushing the buggy is because you want to push a buggy because your baby's in it, you want to go somewhere, but you could care less about a groove in the ground, even anymore if you're walking on pavement, there's no groove in the ground, but you still want to push the buggy. So therefore, even if there is a groove in the ground, you've done nothing because your mind was not attached to that act. That's the idea of perception of an individual superseding a halachic decision. But even that comes up against the wall. Now let's look at how the society can come back on that. Now let's say instead of pushing a wagon, you're pushing a plow. Well, the plow is created to make a groove in the ground. So the fact that the plow is making that groove, your thoughts can no longer supersede the reality of the groove. In other words, in English, we might say that actions are louder than words. So whereas your words and your thoughts were important in one spectrum of this reality, they're not ultimately the reality, because now you have spoken louder, if you will, by using a plow. So here you have a simple example, if you will, of where you have this relationship of perception of a situation versus the reality of the situation and how these two come together. I'll give you another example, maybe it'd be a little easier and maybe more familiar. Let's go into the world of law, criminal law, murder. So you have a dead body, and in front of you is a dead body, and this person clearly has been murdered. And now you've caught the murderer. Well, it doesn't stop there, because even in most courts in the world, and especially found in the Talmud, the state of mind of the murderer will actually have a huge impact on the decision of the judge or the jury. If the murderer is mentally insane and not capable of standing testimony, that's going to have a huge impact on what's going to unfold in this particular murder case. If the murderer actually did intend to murder, but he didn't intend to murder that person, he shot a bullet at the person he was trying to kill, and at that exact same second, somebody else was driving by in a motorcycle, bam, and they got the bullet. He never in a million years meant to kill this guy. Doesn't bring the dead person back to life, but that's an impact. Or he never even meant to kill. Or as I say, He didn't know the gun was loaded. All of these cases, the person in front of you has still been murdered and is still dead. But what will now happen in terms of relationship to this person is all going to be dependent on what was in his state of mind. Perception impacting reality. It's another example in Jewish law. So there's a third one, which kind of feel like maybe we'll start to wrap it up a little bit here. But I think you might, I shouldn't say that. I certainly like this a lot, and I'd like to share it with you as well. I even printed out the Gemaras to be able to read to them. The third example is dreams. In the Jewish approach to dreams, we have a rule that that interpretation follows reality. Dreams follow interpretation. In other words, in the physical world, an event occurs. And now everybody is trying to interpret what has happened. But what has happened is what has happened. That's for sure. And whether or not we can crack that nut and really understand what happened, that's a separate story. But that's what the interpreters are trying to do. They're trying to analyze a reality and understand it in terms of what it is. A dream is in a complete reverse reality, similar to the temple of time, Shabbat, versus the physical temple in the Mishkan or the tabernacle. So by a dream, the impact of a dream will have no bearing in this world without it being interpreted. I'm going to give you an extraordinary example of that, but I just want to first read you a small paragraph here from the Gemara in Horiot of Rebbe Meir. Rebbe Meir says that a person should not act based upon a dream. The Talmud tells of an episode where both Rebbe Meir and another rabbi had the same dream, which is already very interesting. Dream sharing, that's something, don't let Elon Musk know about that. He'll tweak the little, okay, I'm not going to even go there. But anyhow, dream sharing. So yeah, Rebbe Meir and another rabbi had the exact same dream, and in the dream they were commanded to go and meet a particular person. The other person went and was very disappointed by the meeting. And Rebbe Meir did not go because he held of the principle that dreams are not rooted in reality, and therefore they shall not be listened to. Okay. In the Gemara in Brachot is another story of two rabbis who had, again, the exact same dream. This will take a minute or two, so bear with me, please, but I just think it's a worthwhile story. It's in Brachot on 56a if you want to look it up. The Talmud says the story of two of the most famous Amoraim in the Talmud called Abaye and Rava, who dreamt the same dream. And they went to the same dream interpreter. But each received completely different interpretations. Right? Got it? Exact same dream, exact same interpreter. Abaye got one interpretation and Rava got another one. Abaye paid the interpreter for his service, but Rava did not. Abaye received only good news, while Rava only received bad news. When everything the interpreter said came true, Rava came to Abaye to help him understand why, with the same dream, they would have such different results. At one point, Rava went by himself and paid the interpreter. Suddenly, everything he had dreamt came back with a good interpretation. Not much later, it so happened that this man and Rava were on the same boat together. But Rava noticed it and read the bad had and realized, that the bad had come could have been avoided. The only reason his dreams had been interpreted for the bad was because he hadn't made a payment. In his anger, Rava cursed the man. Okay, now the rest of this is kind of like to show you that the Talmud and Hollywood have nothing in common. The Talmud is not interested in happily ever after stories, so I'm not even going to frighten you with the end of the story, but just to simply say that that guy got his upcomings, as we would say, and he did not have a happy ending when Rava realized, which included the death of his wife and his children and all these other horrible things, simply because this gentleman had not been paid, and therefore he was, suffered what he suffered. But we got to look at this a little bit deeper. This idea of a dream does have power. There's no doubt about it. The question is, how does the dream land in our world? So Rebbe Meir says you can cut its legs off and pay no attention to it. Others say you can harness that energy. You have to harness it through an interpreter. And the Gemara bends over backwards with this story to show us that if you have a dream that really agitates you, you should ask somebody who loves you to interpret it. Because the difference between the dream is that the reality of the dream will not become solidified until your words in the physical world give it form. And that's why the last chapter in the Talmud, if you're interested in dream interpretations, you can go to the People's Talmud and look under meditation, and you'll see a whole section there called Dream Interpretations that will carry you within minutes through every single source in the Talmud talking about that. But you will see that images that you see that might appear weird, such as having sex with your mother, Talmud says is actually a sign that you're going to have a great elevation in wisdom. So that the correlation between the visual of a dream and reality are not the same as the correlation between a physical event that you see and what really happened in there. And therefore, it has a whole different mystical power and level that by knowing what these codes are and the symbols that are being used when the dreams are being placed inside of your head, or let's say downloaded, will enable you to really unlock what their powers and their secrets are. So let's kind of put this all together. This idea of obstacle illusions. It means that the obstacle itself is an illusion, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have potent power. It could be that a person is haunted by monsters and ghosts or who knows what, which all the rest of us would laugh at. But for that person, it's so real that it can have damaging effects, physical damaging effects. A person can be so attached to the value of money that if they suddenly lose all of their money, as happened twice in Wall Street, people jump off a roof and commit suicide because they just can't imagine how they're going to live without their money, which had become their God. But when a person is able to live with the blessing of life, rich or poor, and understand that one can live and be enjoyed because they can understand that wherever they are always have this connection of the tree of life where they can elevate themselves by becoming wiser, and wisdom brings a holiness which brings a real spiritual power to be able to withstand very difficult situations, like living in Israel since October 7th, like having grandchildren in the army, like having a grandson who's an ambulance driver going in and out of Gaza and saving 15 people in one day alone during the war, or having friends who've already had their grandchildren killed, or having friends whose grandchildren are who knows what kind of cripple they are forever, or losing 5,000 soldiers, or all and all and all and all, or the world's reaction. No love. Where's the love? Right? We saw the Holocaust. We thought it was never going to happen again. Well, good morning. So how do we respond this time? We have our criticism of our grandparents, or great-grandparents, how they responded then. Now it's our chance. Now they're in heaven looking down. Okay, wise guy. Let's see what you'll do. Let's see what kind of hero you will be. You're going to step up to the plate? You're going to make the right decisions at the right time when you still could? I talk to my friends in Los Angeles right now. I don't know if you track what goes on over there. I said, you got a house that right now is worth $25 million in Bel Air. But if this anti-Semitism gets out of whack, no one's going to buy your home. It's going to be worth zero. And if you've studied anything about the Holocaust, you watch the way the Nazis, Yimach Shamam, came into Austria. It was in a blink of an eye. Just read this book if you haven't read it. It's an unbelievable book. It's called The Hare with the Amber Eyes. It was a Booker Prize-winning book, so it's really a powerful literature. But he tracks his own family experience. They were kind of like the Rothschilds. How that in the moment that they woke in the morning, the Nazi flags were hanging all over the streets, and he ran to the bank to get his money. They said, "I'm sorry, we have no account here." And by the time he got back to his home, the Nazis had already moved in and turned it to their office. So he couldn't even get a passport out. It was fast. When it comes down, it's fast. So you got to be smart. You got to be able to see where things are going and make intelligent decisions. It's life or death. It's not just a joke. And so therefore, we have to be able to have this kind of a wisdom to really open our eyes, not what we want to see, but to see what's being shown so that we can respond appropriately, that we won't create obstacles which are only illusions, but instead we will be able to see the safe way, because God will always afford us that safe way. That's why we are alive, and we're having this class today after 3,500 years of despicable persecution almost everywhere we've ever been on the planet. And that was without an IDF, with nothing, helpless in regimes that have zero tolerance because of the illusions that they lived under, right? Poisoning the wells and all of the rest of this. Christian baby blood being served on Passover. People really buying into insanity, and the ramifications were the death of innocent people. So we have the ability to open our eyes and to be able to see that those things which are obstacles, don't allow things like your value of money or other things to become more important than your life. Make your life the most important thing it is, because it is. There's nothing like that. And with life, no matter what you go through, you can start all over again. Just look at some of the Holocaust survivors. I don't know if you've ever been to the Holocaust Museum in Sydney, Australia. It's not that big, but it's very powerful. I used to live there. That's kind of why I know this, and I don't really track Holocaust museums. But it's built from the air like a Star of David. It has 6 floors, and each floor is another corner of the star. And you're walking through the history of how the Holocaust came and what happened and so on. But the very last top corner is a exhibition of a profile of Australian Jews, survivors. This one became a doctor and saved umpteen hundred people's lives. This one became a scientist and came up with something that bum, 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 bum. This one became a multi-millionaire, which there are many in Australia, who through his donations enabled bum, 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 bum. And you see people rejuvenated and alive, and they did not give up their soul. They continued and began again. It's the magic of the Jewish soul. It cannot die. It cannot die. It can be excavated out of this, but that'll be no different than when I walk into another room. I'm no longer in this room, right? You want to take your car, you want to drive somewhere, you get to where you're going, you can't get out of the car. I don't want to get out of the car. What are you talking about? You've made the trip already. The car's not you. The car's a vehicle that enables you. You're the image of God. What could be better than that? The only problem is we don't believe it. The only problem is we don't really want to think about that or dwell on that, because that would be the tree of life. And that's what we have in front of us. We have a tree of life. Give up on this tree of being so smart. Look what happened to the spies in last week's Parsha. Brilliant Torah scholars who created a sin worse than the golden calf. We got over the golden calf. The sin of the spies, we still sit on the floor every Tisha B'Av because of that. Why? Because these great scholars were so clever and so wise, they thought that our enemies were so powerful that even God couldn't beat them. Aren't there people today, maybe in Israel, who feel like that? That the situation is so overwhelming, even God can't save us? That's the same echo of the spies. That's not Yeshua ben Nun. That's not Kalev, who got up and said the land is Tov Ma'od Ma'od. And we see this all the time. We see it by King David. King David's worst enemies were Doeg and Achitophel. Doeg was the head of the Sanhedrin. We can't even imagine what the Sanhedrin was. You couldn't qualify to sit on this great court if you didn't know 70 languages. You had to know black magic. You had all the Torah had to be known. Just to qualify to be a member of the 70 members of the great court called the Sanhedrin. To be the head, and his contemporary Ahitophel was considered the Gadol Hador, the greatest scholar rabbi of the generation. And in the writings of Kings, in the Book of Kings, there's a story there that says Doeg and Ahitophel went to speak alone in the field. And the Gemara says, alone in the field, there were 45,000 people with them. What does that mean, alone in the field? And it answers, they were so big that as if all those 45,000 people weren't even there. They were alone on the level they were. Yet, you know what they did? They dedicated their life to trying to kill King David. And instead, it was their own downfall. So we have something about us ourselves. We have this wisdom where we're so clever and we know how to work it all out and so on because we like being like God. We like taking hold of that tree of knowledge, and we can say what's right and we can say what's wrong. But that's arrogant. And with a little humility, we could let go of that. And we can take hold of a tree of life and begin to understand how God created us in God's image and the beauty and the blessing that that brings. Okay, I'm going to stop here, but I will have to stop with a joke. I'm sorry. I am allowed a certain quota of jokes, and I don't think I used them all up. So it's better we should laugh and be happy. So there's a guy, and he falls off a cliff to certain death. And as he's falling down, miraculously, whoop, a branch that's sticking out of the side of the cliff catches his shirt, and he's dangling there. And he doesn't know what to do. And he yells out, he says, God, if you're really, really there, please reveal yourself and save me. And sure enough, a booming voice comes out of heaven and said, yes, I am God. And this guy is so excited. And God says, and I will save you. And he's even more excited. And he says, let go of the branch. And the guy thinks for a minute. He says, is there anybody else out there maybe? Laila Tov, Toda Rabba. Thank you so much. I love you guys so much. I'm so jealous that you get to live in Amsterdam. I only lived where everyone walks around saying, damn. But you guys get to live in Amsterdam. So that's even cooler. Love you. Thank you very much. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Laila.
Toda Rabba. Dankjewel.
Bye.
Bye.